Japan is not and will never be a second-tier nation, said Shinzo Abe, Japan's prime minister at the time, in Washington in 2013. He said it at a time when the numbers were already beginning to suggest otherwise. Today they do so even more starkly. The collapse of Japan's stock and property bubbles in the 1990s ushered a long era of stagnation. Japan's share of global nominal GDP fell from roughly 18% in 1995 to just 3.7% in 2025. In 2010, China overtook it as Asia's largest economy. Germany later moved ahead as well. Then there is demographics. Japan's population is not only shrinking, but aging at an alarming pace. Today, almost 30% of Japanese people are 65 or older, the highest share in the world. And yet Abe's claim still holds up. Because even as Japan was losing economic weight, the world around it was changing in ways that made its other assets far more valuable. China's rise, the confrontation over Taiwan, the strategic rivalry between Washington and Beijing, and the AI revolution have all turned capabilities Japan has possessed for decades into critical strategic advantages. The Japanese archipelago is no longer merely a logistical rear base for America's military presence in Asia, as it largely was during the Cold War. It has become central to any potential confrontation with China. At the same time, several little-known Japanese industries now control crucial choke points in the semiconductor supply chain. It is therefore no surprise that Mireia Solis of the Brookings Institution has described Japan as, quote, America's most indispensable ally. Tokyo understands this too, and is now trying to turn its new strategic importance into something lasting. Japan is expanding its armed forces, rebuilding its defense industrial base, and tightening a growing network of regional partnerships. But it is doing so under severe time pressure, and the window may not remain open for long. So what does exactly Japan's transformation look like? And can Tokyo complete it before that window closes? Let's find out. Japan, the world's third largest economy, controlling the bottlenecks of the semiconductor supply chain, the key to defending Taiwan, and the first island chain blocking China's navy from the Pacific. A country that is losing ground in nominal terms while gaining strategic value faster than most people realize. Such discrepancies between what is visible at first glance and what is actually happening can be reflected in the markets. This is evident, for example, in the yen. Decisions by the Bank of Japan or shifts in global sentiment can strongly influence its exchange rate, and the consequences can be felt even on the other side of the globe. That is why I use XTB, the partner of this channel, and the place where I manage my own investments. The platform provides me access to over 11,700 instruments from around the world, along with the latest market news and expert analysis, all in one convenient app. XTB platform also offers real stocks and ETFs with 0% commission up to equivalent to 100,000 euros monthly turnover. Above 0.2% commission applies. XTB also offers retirement accounts in selected markets that may provide tax advantages. The financial instruments offered involve risk. Invest responsibly. Before we turn to the strategic changes now reshaping Japanese policy, we first need to understand the strategy that guided Japan for much of the post-war era, the Yoshida Doctrine, and the foundations on which it was built. World War II ended in total defeat for Japan. The imperial project that had been expanding since the Meiji Restoration and at its height stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands, finally collapsed in August 1945 when atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Soviet forces invaded Manchuria. The defeat was comprehensive. Japan came under American occupation. The United States demilitarized the country, dissolved the Imperial Army and Navy, and imposed a new pacifist constitution. Under Article 9, Japan renounced war and the use of force as means of settling international disputes. At the same time, many members of the pre-war elite were purged from the public life, land reform was carried out, and the zaibatsu, Japan's giant industrial conglomerates, began to be dismantled. The aim was to break apart the institutional foundations of pre-war militarism and create a political system that would make its return far more difficult. But by 1947 and 1948, Washington was already beginning to change course. The onset of the Cold War, the communist victory in China, and then the Korean War convinced American policymakers that continuing to weaken Japan would only make communist expansion in Asia easier. The United States, which had disarmed Japan only a few years earlier, now began pushing it to rearm. It was in these circumstances that a new set of principles emerged to guide Japanese foreign and security policy. They became known as the Yoshida Doctrine, named after Shigeru Yoshida, who served as prime minister for most of the American occupation. The doctrine rested on three basic assumptions. First, Japan's overriding priority should be economic growth. Second, Japan's future security should rest on a close alliance with the United States. Third, Japan should gradually rebuild its own armed forces, but limit their role primarily to the defense of the home islands. Given how rapidly Washington itself was softening its policy toward Japan, Yoshida's approach was actually quite restrained. The clearest example came during negotiations in 1951 between Prime Minister Yoshida and John Foster Dulles, President Truman's special envoy. The Americans proposed creating a new Japanese army of around 300,000 troops. Yoshida argued for just 50,000. This was not because Yoshida was a pacifist. It reflected his assessment of Japan's post-war strengths and weaknesses. A country devastated by war, he believed, could not simultaneously finance economic reconstruction and maintain large armed forces. The better option was a close alliance with the United States, effectively shifting much of the burden of Japan's defense onto Washington. That logic produced the 1951 Security Treaty, which followed American forces to remain in Japan after the occupation formally ended, and later the 1960 Treaty, which committed the United States to Japan's defense. It is worth noting that Article 9 of Japan's constitution did more than constrain Japanese rearmament. It also worked to the advantage of Yoshida and his successors. For decades, it provided Tokyo with political cover to resist taking on broader military commitments toward the United States. The Yoshida Doctrine proved remarkably successful. Access to the American market and technology combined with restrained defense spending allowed Japan to concentrate capital on industry and exports. By 1968, Japan had become the world's third largest economy, behind only the United States and the Soviet Union. That economic focus did not mean Japan was defenseless. The Japan Self-Defense Forces, established in 1954, received roughly 1% of GDP. Given the sheer size of the Japanese economy, that still translated into the largest defense budget in East Asia in nominal terms. Japan built a modern navy and air force, with particularly advanced anti-submarine warfare capabilities, but their mission remained fundamentally defensive. Japan was to serve as the shield, protecting the archipelago and American bases, while the United States provided the spear, nuclear deterrence, and offensive military power. That division of labor suited the realities of the Cold War. American naval and air superiority was overwhelming, while the Soviet Union represented the main threat to Japan. After 1991, however, those conditions began to change. China grew rapidly in both economic and military terms. North Korea expanded its missile arsenal, and successive crises in the Taiwan Strait demonstrated that a major conflict could erupt directly alongside Japan's Nansei Island chain. At the same time, the military gap between the United States and China began to narrow. Tokyo could no longer simply assume that Washington would be able to preserve a regional balance of power favorable to Japan on its own. The old shield and spear model, built on Japanese economic strength and American military dominance, was becoming increasingly ill-suited to the new strategic environment. Successive Japanese governments had been making adjustments to the Yoshida Doctrine since 1990s, but it was Shinzo Abe who brought those changes together into a coherent strategy and gave them lasting institutional form. Abe concluded that Japan could no longer remain passive in the face of mounting threats. It would have to assume greater responsibility for defending its own territory, while also playing a more active role in protecting the broader Indo-Pacific from the growing challenge posed by China. Abe took 3 major steps. He centralized national security decision-making, expanded the scope of military cooperation with the United States, and strengthened a network of partnerships beyond the US alliance. In 2013, Japan established a National Security Council and adopted its first national security strategy. Until then, defense, foreign policy, and intelligence had been fragmented across different ministries. The new institutions strengthened the Prime Minister's hand and made it easier to pursue an integrated strategy spanning the military, diplomacy, trade, and technology. The next major step came in 2014 with a reinterpretation of Article 9. The government concluded that Japan could exercise the right of, quote, collective self-defense, meaning it could use force in response to an attack on a close partner if that attack also threatened Japan's own survival. This gave Tokyo greater flexibility in deploying its armed forces beyond Japan's borders. Abe also broadened the scope of Japanese diplomacy. In 2016, he introduced the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, linking the security of maritime routes with infrastructure investment and the defense of an international order based on the rule of law. A year later, the Quad, the consultation framework bringing together Japan, the United States, Australia, and India, was revived. And when Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Tokyo kept the remaining countries at the table and ultimately helped bring the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, into existence. Abe's reforms still remained within the broad limits of Japan's post-war system. Defense spending stayed close to 1% of GDP. Article 9 remained in the constitution, and the United States continued to provide nuclear deterrence and most offensive military capabilities. What changed was the role Japan was expected to play. Tokyo was no longer supposed merely to provide bases and defend its own islands. It was now expected to help shape the regional balance of power. So this was not a complete break with the Yoshida Doctrine. It was rather a highly creative reinterpretation of it. The next stage came in 2022 under Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Japan's new strategy described China as its, quote, greatest strategic challenge, pledged a major increase in defense spending, and called for the development of counter-strike capabilities. At the same time, it set the goal that by 2027, Japan should be capable of assuming primary responsibility for repelling an invasion of its own territory. One concept helps explain the logic behind this shift: the line of advantage, a term used by American Japan scholar Michael Green. The idea itself entered Japanese strategic thinking in the 19th century through Yamagata Aritomo, then Chief of Staff of the Imperial Japanese Army. Yamagata distinguished between the term line of sovereignty, the state's formal borders, and a broader line of advantage beyond them, areas whose fate directly affected Japan's security. In his time, that primarily meant Korea. The concept was later extended to Manchuria and China, becoming one of the intellectual justifications for Japan's expansion onto the Asian mainland. Modern Japan is obviously not reviving Yamagata's imperial project, but Michael Green interprets Abe's reforms as an attempt to establish a new maritime line of advantage, one defined by trade routes and strategic positions that are essential to the balance of power in the Pacific. For most of the post-war era, Japan left the defense of its outer line largely to the United States. Today, however, Tokyo has to help Washington shoulder that burden, because in a modern Pacific war, the boundary between the line of sovereignty and the line of advantage has become increasingly blurred. Nowhere is this clearer than in the strategic logic of the so-called First Island Chain. The First Island Chain is an arc running from Japan's main islands through the Nansei Archipelago, Taiwan, and the Philippines, all the way to the Malay Peninsula. To its west lie the seas bordering the Chinese coast. To its east stretches the open Pacific. Its strategic importance is straightforward. In the event of a war with China, the First Island Chain could effectively constrain the Chinese Navy's access to the wider Pacific. Taiwan sits at the center of this geography, between Japan's Nansei Islands and the Philippines. If China were to seize Taiwan, it would punch a hole through the First Island Chain and fundamentally alter the military balance in the Pacific. In such a scenario, the Chinese Navy could not only outflank the Philippines and Japan's positions across the Nansei Islands, but also make it far more difficult for the United States to move forces from Guam toward the First Island Chain. Japan does not maintain official diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but the island's importance to this strategic system is so great that in November 2025, Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, invoking the concept of collective self-defense introduced under Shinzo Abe, argued that Japan could come to Taiwan's defense if an attack on the island were judged to threaten Japan's own survival. Taiwan and the First Island Chain, more broadly, therefore, represent Japan's modern line of advantage. Without control over the outer strategic space, defending the line of sovereignty, Japan's own territory, becomes far more difficult. And as we have seen, the distinction between the two is becoming increasingly fluid. Nothing illustrates that interdependence better than the American military bases in Japan. Those bases are essential to US operations in East Asia. Yokosuka is home to America's forward-deployed Carrier Strike Group. Kadena Air Base on Okinawa remains one of the most important air bases in the region, while Iwakuni and Sasebo complete the network of major naval and air facilities. Without access to these bases, any large-scale US military confrontation with China would be extraordinarily difficult. We have already shown this in our wargame examining a hypothetical conflict over Taiwan. In that scenario, only the use of American bases in Japan for large-scale strikes against the Chinese invasion fleet made it possible to prevent Taiwan from falling. But the importance of those bases has another consequence. In a war with China, Japan would not simply serve as America's rear area logistics hub. It would also become one of the first targets of a Chinese attack. War games focused on the Taiwan conflict suggest that Beijing would likely consider preemptive strikes against US military bases in Japan. From China's perspective, only by suppressing American forces in the region could it hope to secure the operational freedom required for an invasion of Taiwan. The same geography that makes Japan indispensable to the United States also exposes it to serious danger and makes neutrality in a confrontation with China increasingly unrealistic. And that is reshaping Japan's military posture. During the Cold War, much of Japan's heavy ground force was concentrated on Hokkaido, where planners expected a possible Soviet attack. Today, the center of gravity is shifting southwest toward the Nansei Islands, a chain of small islands stretching roughly 1,200 kilometers south of Japan's main islands. This is far more difficult terrain to defend than Hokkaido. It requires dispersed garrisons across multiple islands, air defense units, mobile anti-ship missile batteries, and reliable communications and supply lines connecting these outposts with the rest of the country. Japan's defense build-up program for fiscal years 2023-2027 allocates roughly 43 trillion yen, or about $270 billion to strengthening the country's military capabilities. The previous 5-year plan amounted to around 26 trillion yen, or $160 billion, an increase of roughly 65%. The goal is to build an entire operational chain, detect and track the enemy, survive the opening strike, maintain communications, launch counterstrikes, move supplies to the forward islands, and keep fighting until larger US forces arrive. The first element is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Japan is investing in satellite constellations, drones, radar systems, and deeper data sharing with the United States. This is particularly important across the Nansei chain. A radar base has been established on Yonaguni, while Amami Oshima, Miyako, and Ishigaki now host units equipped with mobile anti-ship missile launchers and air defense systems. The second element is the ability to strike back. Tokyo has ordered around 400 American Tomahawk cruise missiles as an interim solution. At the same time, it is introducing an upgraded version of its domestically produced Type 12 missile. Public estimates put its range at roughly 1,000 kilometers, with variants designed to be launched not only from land, but also from ships and aircraft. Japan is also placing much greater emphasis on command and coordination. In 2025, it established the Japan Joint Operations Command, designed to direct operations across all branches of the self-defense forces and coordinate more closely with US Forces Japan. Tokyo is also developing regional communications hubs, data sharing systems, and AI-enabled capabilities. It is worth looking more closely at how Japan is actually spending the money in its current 5-year build-up. Only around 5 trillion yen, roughly $30 billion has been allocated to standoff weapons, the most visible and politically striking element of the program. By contrast, as much as 15 trillion yen, around $90 billion is going toward what Japan calls sustainability and resilience. In other words, Tokyo is spending far more on ammunition, fuel, spare parts, maintenance, storage facilities, and hardening its bases against ballistic missile attacks. The scale of the accumulated weaknesses is considerable. As recently as 2022, around 80% of the self-defense forces buildings lacked protection adequate for the modern missile threat. Shortages of spare parts were also serious enough that components were being removed from grounded F-2 fighters and P-1 maritime patrol aircraft in order to keep other aircraft operational. The current program therefore includes underground command posts, hardened aircraft shelters, additional dispersal sites, fuel storage, and ammunition depots. The objective is simple: disperse Japan's most valuable military assets and ensure they can continue operating even if an adversary succeeds in destroying part of the country's military infrastructure. The hardest problem of all will be logistics across the Nansei chain. Garrisons spread across islands hundreds of kilometers from the main islands could be cut off from their principal bases. Japan is therefore stockpiling supplies locally, building up its own maritime transport units, and preparing civilian ports and airfields for military use. The program includes the acquisition of 10 transport vessels. The number looks modest, but the point is to create a capability that barely existed before, moving troops, missiles, fuel, and equipment between small islands on a routine basis under wartime conditions. Tokyo also wants more sensors and more strike platforms, without the expense of enlarging its fleet of warships and crewed aircraft. That is the purpose of SHIELD, a system combat aerial, surface, and underwater drones funded with 100 billion yen, about $630 million, in the 2026 budget. A large number of relatively cheap platforms can watch the straits, strike targets, and force an adversary to expend more expensive munitions. SHIELD is also an answer to Japan's deepening demographic problems and to the resulting personnel shortages in the self-defense forces. And so Japan's military buildup faces two major constraints: industry and demographics. For decades, Japan's defense sector produced small batches almost exclusively for domestic use. Defense sales accounted for only around 4% of the revenues of companies active in the sector, while profitability was extremely low. As a result, Komatsu withdrew from armored vehicle production in 2019, while Sumitomo Heavy Industries stopped producing machine guns in 2021. This in turn increased Tokyo's dependence on imported weapons and components. Japan's Ministry of Finance estimates, for example, that between 40 and 60% of the parts used in the country's main domestically produced military aircraft come from abroad. In 2023, Japan did not adopt legislation allowing the government to support domestic manufacturers, secure supply chains, and take over production lines at risk of closure. Tokyo is also easing export restrictions and expanding cooperation with the United States, Britain, and Italy. But building a stable defense industrial base will still take time. The personnel situation looks equally difficult, and here additional funding cannot solve the problem on its own. At the end of March 2026, the Self-Defense Forces had around 217,000 personnel against an authorized strength of 247,000, a staffing rate of 88%. But that headline figure conceals severe shortages among the youngest ranks. Manning in the lowest enlisted category stood at just 61%. In fiscal year 2025, Japan recruited around 11,000 personnel against a target of 15,000. Unless the demographic trend reverses, the problem will only worsen as the pool of potential recruits continues to shrink. The limits of Japan's strategic autonomy are clear. Even after completing its current 5-year build-up, Japan will not be able to balance China's power on its own. Tokyo will still need the United States, its nuclear umbrella, satellites, intelligence capabilities, logistical support, and industrial base. And Japanese policymakers understand this. Their strategy is therefore not about moving away from the alliance, but about giving Tokyo a stronger position within it. And this is where the central problem of Japan's strategy emerges. At the military level, integration with the United States is advancing. The two sides conduct exercises, joint planning, and intelligence sharing, while Japan's new command structure is set to gain a stronger counterpart in US Forces Japan, which is being transformed from a largely administrative body into one with its own operational command. At the political level, however, uncertainty is growing. The Donald Trump administration treats alliances in highly transactional terms, tying the fulfillment of alliance commitments to trade, investment, and purchases of American weapons. That makes the United States a less predictable ally and in turn erodes mutual trust. Tokyo is trying to persuade Trump to remain committed to the defense of Japan and the wider Indo-Pacific by accelerating its target of raising broadly defined defense-related spending to 2% of GDP. Tokyo has also pledged a $550 billion investment package in the United States. But the 2026 US National Defense Strategy identified combined spending of 5% of GDP as a desired standard for allies, 3.5% on defense and another 1.5% on broader security. Pressure on Japan to shoulder a larger share of the burden is therefore unlikely to disappear. There is no longer a single fixed price for the American security guarantee. Tokyo may even meet the 5% benchmark only to face another demand later. The most realistic risk is not the formal collapse of the US-Japan alliance, but that Washington's increasingly transactional approach could lead it to seek an accommodation with China over the heads of its Asian allies, or that the United States might respond too slowly or too weakly to a conflict breaking out in Asia, especially over Taiwan. These concerns are not limited to the Trump administration, but extend to his successors as well, because the United States is not formally obliged to defend Taiwan. That does not mean the United States can easily abandon the current status quo. Losing Taiwan would break the first island chain. Losing access to Japanese bases would push a significant share of US forces back toward the second island chain, making it harder to support South Korea and complicate operations across the Western Pacific. The more Japan contributes to the alliance, the higher the cost to Washington of walking away from it. And Tokyo understands this. Japan's current 5-year defense program should therefore also be seen as an attempt to anchor the United States more firmly in Japan. Tokyo's additional insurance policy is what Mireia Solis of the Brookings Institution describes as a strategy of becoming a network power. The goal is not to create an Asian NATO or some regional bloc capable of replacing the United States. Rather, the idea is to build on the US-Japan alliance through close cooperation with other regional partners that share an interest in preserving the American presence in Asia and balancing China. Cooperation has gone furthest with Australia. The two countries conduct military exercises, cooperate on defense industry projects, and a reciprocal access agreement in force since 2023 makes it easier for their armed forces to operate on each other's territory. The Philippines plays a different role. Its islands form the southern section of the first island chain and guard the Luzon Strait. Japan supplies the Philippines with radar systems, strengthens its coast guard, and an agreement in force since 2025 facilitates joint exercises. South Korea contributes highly capable armed forces, advanced intelligence and surveillance systems, and a critical position on the region's northeastern flank. India extends the network into the Indian Ocean, while the Quad provides a framework for coordinating maritime security, infrastructure, and supply chain resilience. European partners, meanwhile, contribute technology, weapons, and political support for freedom of navigation. In Solis's formulation, the network is not limited to the military sphere. Japan also uses infrastructure financing, assistance for coast guards, technological standards, and trade agreements. Keeping the CPTPP alive after the United States withdrew showed that Tokyo can sustain regional rules even when Washington steps back from leadership. Different instruments of this network power serve different purposes. Military agreements improve access to bases. Industrial cooperation expands production capacity, while trade and infrastructure give partners a reason to remain invested in an order favorable to Japan. This network is above all a diplomatic coalition, and we should have no illusions about what it would become in wartime. If a war broke out, it would not automatically transform into a broad anti-China coalition. But that is not its purpose in Tokyo's strategy. It is worth remembering that although Japan is no longer the world's second largest economy, it still controls technological choke points that are becoming especially important in the emerging AI revolution. Ulrike Schede of the University of California described this phenomenon as Japan inside. Japanese consumer brands may no longer be as dominant as they once were, but parts of Japanese industry have moved deeper into the production chain. Japanese companies account for around 53% of the global silicon wafer market, 80% of photoresists, and 88% of the photoresist coating and developing equipment. Replacing these products requires time, expertise, and close cooperation with chip manufacturers. Tokyo is therefore trying to turn the position of its companies into an instrument of economic security. The 2022 National Security Strategy explicitly calls for reducing excessive dependence on individual countries while building the quote superiority and indispensability of Japanese technologies. In semiconductors, this effort is centered on two major projects. The JASM fab in Kumamoto, majority owned by Taiwan's TSMC, began mass production in late 2024 using 1216 nanometer and 2228 nanometer processes. These are mature technologies that remain essential to the automotive and industrial sectors. The foreign investment quickly increased the supply of chips manufactured in Japan and attracted a broader network of suppliers. A far riskier, but potentially much more rewarding project is Rapidus, a company created through cooperation among 8 Japanese firms, including Sony, Toyota, NTT, NEC, and Kioxia. In 2025, Rapidus launched a pilot line for 2nm chips and confirmed the production of its first transistor using the technology. Mass production is planned for 2027. The government is subsidizing the project and holds roughly 59% of Rapidus, hoping that it will become another company in Japan's industrial portfolio capable of sustaining the country's advantage in critical sectors. Despite its undeniable technological strengths, the Japanese economy is not immune to the shock that a war in Asia would bring. In 2025, China accounted for 17% of Japanese exports and 24% of imports. At the same time, Japan imports close to 90% of the energy resources it consumes, much of it along maritime routes from the Middle East. A sudden rupture in trade with China or disruption of those sea lanes would hit Japanese companies hard as well. Tokyo is therefore not seeking a complete break with Beijing. Instead, it is pursuing de-risking, diversifying suppliers, building stockpiles and shifting part of production back to Japan and to partner countries. And yet Japan's greatest long-term problem remains demographics. In 2025, the country had a population of 123.2 million, 583,000 fewer than a year earlier. The population aged 15 to 64 fell to 73.5 million. According to the latest official projection, by 2070, that figure will decline to 45 million, roughly 38% below today's levels. The same shrinking generations will be expected to staff the self-defense forces, defense plants, semiconductor factories, the care sector, and the rest of the economy. The military is therefore competing for workers with companies that often offer higher salaries and easier working conditions. Automation and unmanned systems will reduce some personnel requirements, but they will not eliminate the need for technicians, operators, and logistics personnel. An aging society is simultaneously driving up spending on pensions, healthcare, and long-term care. In Japan's 2026 budget, nearly 40 trillion yen, around $250 billion was allocated to social security, compared with roughly 9 trillion yen or $56 billion for defense. Japan can buy itself some time through automation, robotics, higher workforce participation among women and older people, and the gradual opening of its labor market to foreign workers. But there is no magic solution. Even if Japan managed to reverse its negative demographic trends, that would not translate into a larger pool of workers and military recruits before the mid-2040s. In short, Japan's reforms are not designed to achieve strategic autonomy or allow Tokyo to operate independently of the United States. Their main purpose is to strengthen Japan's ability to defend its own territory and make it a stronger pillar of the US alliance. The reforms, therefore, reflect a realistic assessment of Japan's own strengths and limitations. If implemented as planned, by the end of the decade, Japan could become a strong enough component of the Allied deterrence system to challenge the assumption among some strategists in Beijing that a future conflict could end in a Chinese victory. That is a far more realistic measure of success than expecting Japan to wage a prolonged war on its own against a power with a larger defense budget, population, and nuclear arsenal. But such a system still has to pass three tests. First, Japan's command structure, air force, and logistics must be able to keep functioning even if Chinese ballistic missiles begin striking Japanese bases. That requires a massive expansion of infrastructure and the hardening of existing facilities. Second, missile launchers and unmanned systems must receive up-to-date targeting data and operate seamlessly alongside US forces. Third, political decisions on the use of force must be made quickly enough for the self-defense forces to exploit their full capabilities from the very first day of a war. Japan's transformation is therefore leading toward even deeper interdependence with the United States. The relationship will remain asymmetric, though far less one-sided than it was under the Yoshida Doctrine. And this is probably where the greatest risk to Japan's strategy lies. Tokyo assumes that the United States will remain committed to defending the Pacific, and that Washington will continue to understand the strategic importance of Japan, Taiwan, and the First Island chain as a whole. That is an entirely rational and logical assumption. The problem is that not every actor in international politics behaves rationally or logically, and strategic interests do not always translate automatically into political decisions. Abe said in 2013 that Japan would not become a second-tier nation. In that sense, he succeeded. Japan is now America's most indispensable ally, but being a first-tier nation is not the same as being secure.